This is Class 8, our first of a two-part class on Puritan poetry. This particular class, we're going to be dealing with the two most important poets of the American Puritan period, the 17th century. We're going to be reading out of the Harrison Meserole anthology there. But I want to start out talking a little bit about Puritan aesthetics. We did talk about that a little bit in literary theory. But one thing we didn't get around to is what it is that the Puritans really valued sort of theoretically in art in general, not just in literature, but in, painting, sculpture, all of those kinds of things. We talked a little bit when we read through the Miller anthology about Puritan literary theory, the plain style and these kinds of things, and so on. But one of the things I want to introduce you to is something that I only have just a moment to mention. You can go read it on your own. It's a classic book by M.H. Abrams called The Mirror and the Lamp, in which I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version, so don't yell at me if you've already read it and you say, that's too simplistic. Of course it is. Essentially, M.H. Abrams in that book took a look at different countries, different cultures in the West especially, different time periods, and came up with the notion that in different periods of time in Western history, people have tended to look at art, its nature, function, value, purpose, in different ways. In ancient Greece, they tended to embrace the mimetic notion of art, that is, that art should represent reality. It should be as realistic as possible. In the Roman period, for example, they embraced the Horatian notion from Horace, the poet, who wrote the odes and so on. Aut prodesse, aut delectare, that art ought to please and to delight. So the Romans brought something different. They said, look, it should be something pleasing, but it also, to teach and to delight. Aut prodesse, prodesse means to teach and to delight. All great art ought to aim at teaching people something, maybe a moral lesson or something about life, but it ought to be pleasant and enjoyable. Okay, so it ought to combine those two. So that, to the Romans, was the highest form of art if it did both of those things. He also goes on and talks about the expressionistic or expressive view of art that comes along with the Romantics, where the important thing that art should do is express the thoughts, ideas, or feelings of the artist himself. And then the objective view of art, where art should be is studied. New criticism does this, for example. Looks at art as an object in and of itself, how it's put together, right, and so on and so forth. Well, you can do all this kind of stuff with Burke. It's very Burkean. But bottom line is, how did the Puritans look at art? Well, if you look at it through M.H. Abrams' four different categories there, they were very much in the mimetic camp for the most part, possibly the Horatian camp, but not terribly. The argument would be, well, wouldn't they want literature to teach a moral lesson? Yes, somewhat, but they were really not that interested in art entertaining. So they embraced the sort of the didacticism of art, but they didn't embrace the notion that literature ought to be entertaining so much, or should be pleasant. I mean, it's nice that it's pleasant, but it isn't a thing that one aspires to in one's poetry to make it pleasant. Now, those are all huge generalities, right? We're just lumping all these Puritans in together, and we're trying to say, well, over this 100-year period of time when people wrote poetry, what did they do? Well, X. Well, you can't quite do that. We're not even distinguishing between certain types of poets at this time. We're not even distinguishing between certain types of poetry during this time, and I do want to hit on that, the difference between public and private poetry, and how Puritan poetry, that is for public consumption, tends to be more didactic, as I said. It has a social agenda to try to get people to behave, to try to get people to do something. We'll see that with Michael Wigglesworth a little bit later on. To try to get people to change their opinions, to change their mind. It's more rhetorical in focus frequently. The private poetry, however, generally is done for the same purposes that a journal would be done. That is, personal spiritual journey, personal struggles, exploring one's spiritual state. We're going to be looking here at two leading figures, Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on both of these here in this lesson, and then we'll deal with the minor poets in part 2, which I hope to have posted shortly thereafter. Anne Bradstreet, probably the greatest poet the country ever produced, in my opinion, prior to Edgar Allan Poe. Certainly the most prominent female writer prior to the 19th century, in my view. And we'll get into her. A more recent fellow, I say recent, even though he was a little bit later than Bradstreet, but more recent in terms of his being recognized, is Edward Taylor, someone whose works weren't even really discovered or published until the 1930s. So he's a new guy on the block, and we'll take a look at him. Both of these folks were writing, initially at least, for private purposes. Both of them ended up having their poetry published. One during her lifetime, one very much posthumously. We'll talk about both of them as we go forward and see what you see. They're very different poets. Even though I think these are the two best Puritan poets, they're very, very different from one another. Got some similarities, but very, very different.